Father, is it over? No, my son. Hold tight, for it's going to be a long video to make. This is what you've been waiting for. The power within your grasp. Sacrifice your soul and join the dark side. Become unholy. This is the Unholy Death Knight PvP guide for Cataclysm 4.3.4. I'll be going through my written guide that I created almost 4 years ago now. The written guide is around 20 pages long, and I will have to dissect it into several parts. Nexxuz was my third Death Knight on max level that I created on Cataclysm. I only had one Death Knight on Alliance and one Death Knight on Horde, and I wanted to play with different people on Alliance, so I had to create a new Death Knight. So that's what I did in 2014, and then by 2016 I was getting all the achievements. Now let's start off with the talents and glyphs. As far as talents go, there's no real question to what you should be getting, other than some people like to roll Rage of Rivendare, which is a pretty good talent, and it's questionable whether you want to take it or not. Another thing, Sudden Doom. I think rank 2 of Sudden Doom is worth it because it procs so much more than rank 1, but I wouldn't give it rank 3 because it's usually unnecessary to have that many death coils, and you're also risking that you would proc another death coil when you didn't use the first proc. It would overwrite the previous proc. Then you have Endless Winter. From my experience, you don't need the Mind Freeze to be completely free because you most of the time you have the 10 runic power anyway. And Blighted Armor is especially valuable on later seasons because you have more armor value, thus giving you more attack power. As far as glyphs for the Unholy, there's really no question as to what to take. Glyph of Death Coil for increased damage and healing of Death Coil. Death Coil is one of your main damage dealing spells and also healing. Raise Dead for buffing the ghoul. And Icy Touch, since your diseases are one of your biggest damage dealers. And since we are not using Scourge Strike in our rotation, it's not worth putting the Glyph of Scourge Strike. Glyph of Anti-Magic Shell, 2 seconds extra to it. It's amazing. Glyph of Death Grip, because oftentimes it happens that you're far away from the target and you need the 5 extra yards to grip him. And Strangulate. If you strangulate someone mid-cast, it gives you additional 2 seconds of Strangulate on them. And for the minor glyphs, Glyph of Horn of Winter for longer buff. Glyph of Blood Tap, so that when you blood tap you don't get damaged by it. And Glyph of Death's Embrace for the runic power refund every time you either heal your ghoul, which happens especially in arenas against classes like Affliction Warlock or Fire Mage, who do a lot of AoE and damage your ghoul, and sometimes even kill it. And when you're healing with Lichborn, you can also heal a lot more since it refunds half of the runic power you use. Another option would be Resilient Grip, for when you try to death grip a hunter in Deterrence or Paladin Bubble. But if you're a skilled player, this will most likely not happen to you. Now for stats, you want to go Strength, Haste, and then Mastery or Crit. Mastery and Crit are pretty equal, but before dealing with any secondary stats like Haste, Mastery, and Crit, First of all, you need 5% hit chance, which is the minimum and the optimal amount. 5% hit chance equals 600 hit rating. You don't want to have less than that, because having a chance to miss with one of your important spells and abilities is not worth it. It can be slightly higher, but the closer you are to 5%, the better, because you're not losing on any other potential secondary stats. And spell penetration cap, which is 195, you can achieve this by getting plus 70 spell penetration cloak enchant and blue gems, which give you plus 50 spell penetration each, plus 50 spell penetration to your blue sockets with Stormy Ocean Sapphire. If you have Tailoring Profession, which is the best profession you can get, just like I do, which gives you the cloak enchant, then you cannot apply this plus 70 spell penetration cloak enchant, which means you will have to get one extra blue gem, and you can put this gem, for instance, in your relic. The Sword Guard Embroidery enchant on your cloak gives you 1000 attack power proc, which is around 400 strength, and that's the best cloak enchant you can get and the best profession overall for both PvP and PvE. It is good to track this enchant and when it proc for when you want to burst. The add-on I'm using for tracking all the procs is Tell Me When, and here I got a line where I track Sword Guard Embroidery, that's the tailoring cloak enchant proc. I track Surge of Victory, which is my PvP trinket, the one that procs, Insignia of Victory, and Unholy Strength buff, which is the buff that you get from your Rune of the Fallen Crusader on your weapon. Ideally, what you want to do in the rotation is you track these 3 procs, and as soon as all of them 3 proc, you want to pop your gargoyle then. So use Unholy Frenzy, ideally, followed up by the trinket, unused trinket, and then you pop your gargoyle for an insane damage. Your gargoyle copies all the stats that you have on yourself at the moment when you cast the gargoyle. That means the moment that you have all these things procced, your trinket used your Unholy Frenzy for additional haste, you pop the gargoyle. What I like to do in 1v1 is that right after I pop my gargoyle with the Unholy Frenzy buff, I cancel the Unholy Frenzy. I have a macro for it right here. And so that it doesn't decrease my HP, because Unholy Frenzy works so that it takes 2% of your maximum health every 3 seconds. And that's quite a bit, especially if you're in a 1v1 situation against a feral or a rogue. You don't want to sacrifice that health, but you want to use the Unholy Frenzy to buff your gargoyle so you can cancel it afterwards. I advise using full PvP gear. Potentially you can use some overpowered heroic weapon or a strong PvE trinket. Weapons such as heroic Gorthalak would be amazing, but I wouldn't use too many PvE items since Unholy Death Knight is pretty squishy outside of his defensive cooldowns. That's why you struggle against ferals and rogues, especially since your AMS is not helpful against them. So you're losing one of your strongest defensive cooldowns when fighting against ferals and rogues. If you're playing with a healer in 2v2, you can definitely afford to use more PvE pieces since you don't want the games to drag for too long. So for stats, you want to have the maximum amount of strength you can get. That's your primary stat, and maximum haste as a secondary stat. Once you are hit and spell penetration capped, you're ready to go. Expertise is not necessary for a Death Knight. You can have 0 expertise because we want to maximize the damage of our dots and maximize the usage of Gargoyle through haste. Our abilities, which can be parried, are only Plague Strike, which we don't use that much, and Necrotic and Festering Strike. Majority of our damage though comes from dots, and Pats and Death Coil, not from us directly. As for the rotation, most people say there's not such thing as rotation, which I completely disagree with. You have an opener that is ideal. The ideal opener would be Chains of Ice, number 1, to apply the Frost Fever dot and slow the target. Then you would use Plague Strike, again to apply AoE slow and apply the second dot, the Blood Plague. Then you would go for Necrotic Strike to use the second Unholy Rune. Festering Strike, you could use Blood Strike too, but it's not necessary. This is a micromanagement where you would want to use Blood Strike if there is no way you would use the second Blood Rune, since you are going to be using Chains of Ice a lot. That means you will not have the 2 runes, the 1 Blood and 1 Frost rune for Festering Strike a lot of the time, since you will be using the Frost runes to apply slow with the Chains of Ice. That means Blood Strike could be used in the situations where you have that 1 free Blood rune and you have no other abilities to use it for. Okay, so again, opener, Chains of Ice, Plague Strike, Necrotic Strike, Festering Strike, and then you burst. At this point you should have enough runic power to burst, meaning you pop your Unholy Frenzy, your DPS Trinket, and your Gargoyle. Again, if you don't want to lose those 30% of HP or so during Unholy Frenzy, especially in 1v1 duels and similar situations, you can cancel the Unholy Frenzy with the macro. Then the priority is to keep both of your dots on the target, Frost Fever and Blood Plague. You refresh them with Chains of Ice and Plague Strike, or potentially with Outbreak. Outbreak is great for applying dots, however it does not slow the target. That's why I like to use Chains of Ice, especially on the opener where it's likely that the opponent will be running. Use Death Coil to dump runic power, or use it in between using other abilities that consume your runes. It is always good to have at least 10 runic power, since we want to be able to mind freeze or use defensives such as Icebound Fortitude, which uses 20 runic power to activate, or even Dark Simulacrum, which also uses 20 runic power to activate. Why do we want to use Death Coils in between using abilities that consume runes? We don't want to spam Death Coils or spam just those abilities that consume rune. It is because Death Coils give us the Runic Corruption buff, which is activated for 3 seconds after using a Death Coil. So if you were to spam one Death Coil after another, it is likely that you would overwrite the previous existing Runic Corruption buff that would still be going on, and you would be losing on potential 100% rune regeneration from it. That's why it's good to have that 3-second window between using the Death Coil. Continuing with the rotation and priority, you use Unholy Runes to apply Necrotic Strikes. You use Festering Strike to use the Blood and Frost runes and convert them into Death runes. And again, as I mentioned previously, you may use Blood Strike if you have the additional Blood rune that you would not use. Then you use Chains of Ice, Horn of Winter if there's nothing else to use. Horn of Winter not only provides you with the buff, but it also generates 10 runic power. Then if you have nothing to use, even after Horn of Winter, you can use Blood Tap, which refreshes 1 death rune instantly. And finally, Empower Rune Weapon, very strong cooldown on a 5-minute cooldown, so you better think twice when is the right time to use it. If there's nothing else to use, your Blood Tap is on cooldown, it will immediately activate all your runes and generate 25 runic power. Some additional notes: we don't use Icy Touch in PvP to apply Frost Fever. We use Chains of Ice because it not only applies the dot, but it also slows the target, which is immensely important. It is important to track your dots and their duration on the target. Add-ons can help you with this. Add-ons such as Tidy Plates or Tell Me When or Power Auras. you have to count with the fact that you can get parried on Plague Strike, which oftentimes happens against ferals or rogues, even other Death Knights, and then you have to use Plague Strike again to apply the dot on the target. If your target decides to dispel himself, if you're fighting against Retribution Paladins, healers, and so on, you have to apply a Death Coil as soon as possible, because you have a talent that gives you the ability to make the dots undispellable for some time on the target. The talent is called Unholy Blight. It may happen that you run into an opponent that decides to dispel his dots. I like to do that at the opener. If I'm fighting against a Death Knight and I'm playing a Retribution Paladin and we're far away from each other and he decides to apply dots on me, I will cleanse them instantly because I'm still not on the target. There's not much other stuff that I can do. He didn't apply a Death Coil debuff with Unholy Blight on me yet, so I'm able to dispel the dots. And that means he will have to use his valuable Frost and Unholy runes to reapply the dots again. And he will not be able to do much damage because he will not be able to use Necrotic or Festering strikes, since he has to use the runes to apply the dots again. Scourge Strike is an ability that I don't use pretty much ever, since on Cataclysm every single class has a heal of some sort, or plays with a healer on team. So that's why I only use Necrotic Strike to consume my Unholy runes and never use Scourge Strike. Death and Decay and Blood Boil are abilities that you can use to try to find your opponents if they're stealthers and destroy their opener. Especially Death and Decay happens to me very often that I manage to find enemy rogues and ferals in stealth at the beginning of arena with Death and Decay and destroy their opener. I would only use Blood Boil if you're really sure that the opponent is around you, otherwise it's a waste of one blood rune. In normal rotation you never use Death and Decay and Blood Boil. There's much better use of these runes. Since Death and Decay consumes your Unholy rune, that means you have to sacrifice a Necrotic Strike. You can also use Blood Boil as soon as Hunter uses Snake Trap on you to kill those pesky snakes from the trap. So these were the basics of the offensive rotation of an Unholy Death Knight in PvP. Of course, in PvP, it is never a perfect situation. You always have to adapt, use defensive cooldowns when you have to, even death strikes sometimes if you're really desperate. Oftentimes you will have to use Chains of Ice a lot more to slow down the enemies, to peel for your healer. Now I would like to explain to you what Runic power is. Every single rune that you consume generates 10 Runic power. The only exception to this is with Chains of Ice. If you have PvP gauntlets equipped, they give you a bonus which makes your Chains of Ice ability generate an additional 10 Runic power. So normally Chains of Ice is 1 rune ability. That means it would generate 10 Runic power. However, with these PvP gauntlets, it generates 20 Runic power. You use Runic power for death coiling once in 3 minutes for Gargoyle. You also use it for your Icebound Fortitude and your Kick, depending on how many talents you put in your Mind Freeze and the Frost Tree. You also use it for Death Pact and Dark Simulacrum.
At long last, no YouTube video takes forever to make, Meytrix. I see endless YouTube uploading before me.
They're called Stormy Ocean Sapphire? How is it pronounced? Hold on.
Sapphire.
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 Father, is it... Fuck.